Hey, Kings Hill, it's a privilege and an honor to be bringing you God's Word today. I wish that we were meeting face to face, that I could see you, we could interact, and that we would be gathered and worshiping God together. But this is the means and the ways that we are gathered for worship right now, and so it's still a privilege to bring you God's Word today. We're continuing in this series on seeking the kingdom, and today's topic is talking about fasting. Now, I think fasting is perhaps one of the least discussed spiritual disciplines, likely probably one of the least practiced amongst most people. And you know, to be talking about, oh, we're going to be talking about I should not eat, or I shouldn't be doing things, that's kind of a scary topic for some. And so I understand that. But I do hope that you'll stay with us, because this is something that's been given to us by God so that we would glorify Him more. And that we could worship better. And so that's what we're seeking to do, even as we gather, as we open His Word, as we want to glorify God. And so that's our intent. And so I hope you're along for the journey today on that. As we begin, I want to be able to provide us a good definition. What do we mean by fasting? So I think a good definition is this: a Christian's voluntary abstinence from food for spiritual purpose. A Christian's voluntary abstinence from food for spiritual purpose. Now, there's some really good and important elements to that definition. First off, it says that this is for the Christian, namely because this practice is focused on God. Now, fasting itself is not anything new. Most of the major world religions have advocated for some form of fasting from one time or another, or you could even choose to just fast for no reason at all. I mean, you're not having to have a reason for it. There's really no eternal value in and of itself of simply fasting. And so if you're not a believer and you go, oh, okay, so we're talking about this is something God is asking us to do, simply fasting, it doesn't bring you any closer to God. It doesn't change anything. But for the believer, now it is something that is coming out of a response to God. And so that's why it is for the Christian. And so even if that's not you today, if you're like, I don't follow Jesus, I'm not sure about this, I'm just kind of curious, stay with us. There's a lot to be learned today from this about how we're seeking after and glorifying God in our lives. And so I just didn't want anyone to be led astray and says, oh, I should just follow this practice. But instead, it's for the believer. Secondly, it's voluntary. It says it's voluntary. If you're coerced, or if your heart is not fully in it, or perhaps I'm in a position where I can withhold food from you, then you've simply gone hungry, or you've gone without something. That doesn't mean that you've truly experienced a Christian fast. You would want to have your heart to be fully in it. And third, he says that this is an abstinence from food. And already you're going, no, wait. Can't I say I'm just going to be fasting from watching TV? Or, you know what, I'm going to fast from social media for the next week. Is that not a legitimate form of fasting? And it is, but because, that's being included in a broader definition of what we would mean by fasting, it would include anything legitimate like that. But the point that is missed by only doing so is that with food, you're fasting from something good that has come from God Himself. Food is itself good. It provides nourishment. It's providing strength. It's providing energy. These are all really great things. And so fasting is temporarily abstaining from something good because it expresses your desire for something greater, which is for God Himself. So we're saying no to this great gift because we say we want more of God Himself. So fasting is a way of saying with our stomach and with our whole body how much we need and how much we want and trust in Jesus Himself. And so I do want to recognize from the start that for some, there may be some medical reasons that fasting from food for even any period of time may be hazardous or dangerous. And so I recognize that from the start. That's part of our sinful nature and things that we have. And so as we consider fasting from food specifically, that may be a discussion you need to discuss with your doctor, with a medical physician of some sort, to see what limitations that there may be. but I wanted to press from the beginning that I think this abstinence from food is a really important part. But he also says that it's for spiritual purposes. Fasting isn't just some sort of like crash diet or a great way of losing weight or perhaps even a way to impress others, which we're going to see in just a little bit. But Christian fasting is for spiritual purposes. And these purposes we're going to be exploring a little bit later in our time as well. And so as we think about defining fasting, I think it's helpful to also consider, what does fasting look like? What kind of fast do we find? Even as we look in the Bible, what kind of fast do we see? And I think that they come in three main types that we can discuss. First, from what should you fast? From what should you fast? And the first one is I'm going to call it the normal fast. I think it's the one we would see most often, and that would be abstaining from food, but still continuing to drink water. And we see this particularly even in the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4, that he was there and he was continuing to drink, but had been without food. So that's what we'll call the normal fast. But perhaps another type would be a partial fast. This would be some sort of a limitation to the diet. This is similar to something we would see in like Daniel, at the beginning of Daniel, when they've chosen to only eat certain foods, or perhaps even with John the Baptist, who was eating locust and wild honey. And those were his diet that he had as he was in the desert. And so we might call a partial fast. But another type would be an absolute fast. An absolute fast, so taking no food, having no water as well. We see examples of these types of fast in Ezra 10, as Ezra is trying to rebuild. We see this from Esther in the Jews before Esther is to go before the king. She asked for 3 days of no food and no water. And we also see this in from Paul in Acts chapter 9. So that's an absolute fast, no food and no water. And I do want to draw another category that's kind of related, and I've seen it labeled the supernatural fast. The supernatural fast. Now this is an absolute fast that's going longer than what the human body should normally be able to do. We see this, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9, when it says that Moses, as he went up on Mount Sinai with God, he was there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he reports that he had no food and he had no water during that time. Later on, we'll see Elijah does the same thing. He's at the same mountain and spends 40 days there with God in 1 Kings chapter 19. So these are an absolute fast that normally the human body is not able to last for that long, to be able to make it. It is only God sustaining that individual through that. So we have a normal, a partial, and an absolute were the three main categories, and then a supernatural there. So that's what should you fast from. But we might also see, like, with who should you fast? And so I think there's a few categories. The most common one here is normally a private fast. This is where no one else, besides perhaps a spouse, or maybe you have a regular lunch or dinner gathering that you always meet with some people, that if you just didn't show up or didn't eat that day, it would be a little weird. But just being able to share with just a couple of people that are going to see these routines in your life if you were fasting. But this is something between you and God, something that's going on in your heart as it's doing that. So that would be a private fast. And we're going to be seeing that example come up in Matthew here in just a few minutes. Another type of fast would be a congregational fast. This is where the church is choosing to all come together, all to fast at the same time, likely for the same purposes. We see this in Acts chapter 13. The elders and the whole church are fasting together, and they sense the Spirit saying, "Send out Barnabas and Paul for this mission work that they have." And so that's an example of a church that's a congregational fast. There's also plenty of examples throughout the Bible of like a national fast, where the people of Israel have called the whole nation to come and to fast and to pray. There's also good examples of a local fast. The city of Nineveh, after Jonah has gone and to preach to them for repentance. They are repenting, and the leaders of the city call upon all the people to fast before the Lord and to repent. And so we're seeing this as a sign of remorse and things for the city, that they would turn back. And so that's even a local fast. But we might also need to explore, how often should you fast? How often should you fast? And there's a couple examples here. One is that it might be on a regular schedule. The law did require at least some fast, normally like on the Day of Atonement. In God's law, we'd see that the people should fast. Later on, we see that the people of Israel instituted at least 4 other fasts that we can see. So every year as it came up, that they would fast on these same days. And if it wasn't regularly scheduled, then our other option is that it would be occasional. I think like the example of the church as they were about to send out Barnabas and Paul was not a regularly scheduled fast, but it was something that they were seeking of, like, how can we advance the kingdom of God from this church? And they began to fast and to pray about it. And the answer came that they should be sending out Barnabas. They should send out Paul. And so I think that's a good example, likely, of an occasional fast, just one that has come up due to certain issues, or just because it was time to press in closer to God. But by far the most common, and the type that for the most part we have in view today, is going to be a normal fast, one that's abstaining from food but not from water, likely private and occasional. I think that would be the most common, one that's a normal abstaining from just food, that you're doing privately, and occasional, although there's great merit of scheduling that out and having it on a rhythm. Those are things that we can tease out a little bit later. And so that's kind of a good definition. And so while we can understand fasting, why should Christians practice this means of grace? And I want to give us about 5 different reasons. Why should we practice this? And the first is that it's a means of worship. Fasting is a means of worship. Look with me in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 16. Here we see, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Now, I draw our attention to this passage because it's directly following the passage that we looked at last week about how we should pray, the Lord's Prayer, or perhaps the disciples' prayer, as we said. So it's following directly after that. Jesus is giving this Sermon on the Mount, and later in this chapter, in verse 33, Jesus instructs us to seek first the kingdom. This is our theme for this series, is that we should seek first the kingdom. And because as we're seeking the kingdom, this is how we're putting ourselves in position to receive more of God's grace. We're coming to Him and approaching Him in the way that He would ask us to do so. But notice, first off, in our text today, it says that, "and when you fast." It says, "and when you fast." Now, this is the 3rd time in chapter 6 that we're actually seeing this type of a phrasing. In verses 2 and 3, we see, "and when you give," which is actually going to be our topic for next week, so stay tuned for that. So it says, "when you give." 3 times in verses 5 through 7, we have, "and when you pray." And now we see in verse 16, he says, "and when you fast." And so it's when we're participating in these actions that we are seeking the kingdom. And so notice with me the pattern of this teaching on fasting. Jesus is going to give us a negative, he then gives us a positive, and then he's going to give us a promise. Now the negative, he says, there were some that when they were fasting, that they would dishevel their look, that they would mess up their hair, they'd put dirt on their face, they would change their clothing, they would make it very obvious. He says, "I am fasting, I am not my normal self, I haven't eaten, and so just know that I'm fasting." They desired to draw attention to themselves. They wanted to draw attention to the fact that they were having a fast. And so Jesus says, he says, they're going to have their reward. They were seeking to have recognition, and people say, "Oh, look how righteous or how pious they are. Look, they're having a fast. I don't think I could ever go without a meal. They must be holier than I." It says they will get their reward because they will get the attention that they are deserving. But the positive command here is to fast in such a way that the only one that will notice will be our Father in heaven. Now, you might normally think that fasting is this like external sign of an internal change that's going on in your heart. So you say something is happening internally on me, inside me, that's wanting me to focus more on God, and as a result of that, I'm doing something with my body. I'm having this external sign. But what Jesus is actually starting to say, he's saying, no, instead of this being an external sign, this is more like an internal sign of an internal reality that's happening in your heart. And so, as you're going about your day, you would be outwardly just doing the same things you would normally be doing, either going to work or going to class, or I guess in this case, attending Zoom classes and meetings and the such. But you would be going about your normal day and everything would seem to be fine and normal, but on the inside, you would be in prayer and adoration and song and worship to God through your fasting. So that's the positive command. Don't draw attention to it, but instead, make this a private thing that's going on between you and God, because the focus is to be on Him all along. And that's the promise. He says that those desiring attention will receive their reward. But Jesus says that those that fast out of the right conditions of the heart, they're going to get their reward as well. So what does he mean? What is this reward? That's really found in the Lord's Prayer that was just before us. The reward is that God's name would be hallowed, that He is glorified. The reward is God's kingdom coming, that God's will would be done on earth. The ultimate reward is the supremacy of God in all things. If the reward was anything for ourselves, if by fasting we gained something, if we were to receive something from God, then the focus would have been on us all along. But instead, the focus says, no, I'm fasting and I'm abstaining from this because I'm wanting more of you, God. So fasting helps increase our worship and our love for God. In this way, it's a servant to our faith in God. It's helping to increase it and to drive it up. It's not a substitute for our faith, that therefore gaining anything for us, but instead we have faith in God. We have faith in who Jesus is and what He has done for us. And because of that, now this is helping us to increase, and it's a means of worship. But secondly, it's going to show our hunger for God. It shows our hunger for God. Flip over just a couple of pages with me to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 14, we see this. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Now, what Jesus is teaching us about fasting isn't simply a patching up of some old practices to say this is the new way to do it now. But he says, but the practice of fasting for the believer is going to completely change. For the follower of Jesus, this is a new practice. See, previously Israel was longing for the Christ, for the Messiah to be coming. I think of Luke 2. We hear the story of a woman named Anna. We learn that Anna had been a widow after only 7 years of marriage, and had since then been in the temple day and night. And it said that she was always there worshiping with prayer and with fasting. She did this until age 84, likely having spent more than 60 years fasting and praying and longing for this Christ to come. What she had was a hope. It says one day the Messiah is going to come, and she was holding on to that hope. But now this is not simply just a hope. Jesus Christ has come to earth. He has lived a perfect life. He died for our sins. He rose from the grave, defeating death once and for all. And now he's returned to be at the right hand of the Father in heaven. But he says, one day I will be coming back. I'm going to come back and I will end all pain and suffering and death. And I will be coming back and I will reign as you were expecting before. And so our longing, our hunger for God is not simply a hope, but it's a longing for his return, for the consummation of all things as the bridegroom comes to get his bride, the church. We long for the bridegroom to come back and to take up his kingship. See, before it was a longing, it was longing for just a future reality. It says one day this Messiah is going to come. But now we're in a whole another spot. Now that Jesus has come, we live in the reality in the present, knowing that the Messiah, the Christ has come. Jesus has come and has been on this earth. And we also look forward to the future. This is a new type of a hunger and a longing for that Messiah to come, because we know he has already defeated death, that he has done everything he needed to on the cross, and we're waiting for him to come back and to once and for all make everything right. So in Matthew 9, the disciples of John, they're still living under the law. They're asking Jesus why his disciples aren't fasting. But the reason is really quite simple. The king is present now, and so it is a time to feast. So the disciples' lack of fasting is actually a testimony. It's a witness to the fact that the king is present with them now. But Jesus promises, he says, there will be a time when I'm going to leave. When I leave and before I get back, then they will fast. Well, what he's saying, he says, right now the king is with them. Church, that's our position today. We're longing for, we're hungering for God. Fasting is expressing with our whole body our desire to see God return. We want to see Jesus returning and to make everything right. And so we hunger and we long for that. But the third purpose that we could see is that it puts an edge on our affections. It puts an edge on our affections. Now that's perhaps a weird phrase, but we owe it to Matthew Henry, who was a pastor in England in the late 1600s. And what he means is that at times our emotions or even our thoughts can tend to become a little more dull. It's as if you have the same pocket knife. If you carry a pocket knife every day, I don't. If so, I'd have it, but yet, if you carry it every day and you're using it to open things or to cut through a rope, or perhaps you gotta cut up an apple to eat for a snack, as that knife comes into contact with the things that it's working on, those things begin to dull the blade. The sharp ends become to be broken off, and they become to be flattened and to be dull, and the knife after a while is not very useful anymore. It's not like it used to be. Now the solution for the pocket knife would be to take the blade and wipe it on a whetstone or a similar device, and to rub that edge and to form it back into becoming a sharp point again. Now fasting can do the same thing for your affections with God. Instead of exposing yourself to the desires of the world, which slowly dull our affections, you slowly make small choices that prefer God instead of your desires. We start preferring God instead of your desires. John Piper puts it this way. He says, many small acts of preferring fellowship with God above food can form a habit of communion and contentment that makes one ready for the ultimate sacrifice. It keeps the preferring faculty on alert and sharp. It forces us to ask repeatedly, do I really hunger for God? So we start having many small choices that say, in this decision, I'm going to prefer God over something else. So as we're thinking about fasting, it says, in this moment, I'm going to prefer God and longing after Him over the food that I would rather eat. So I choose God over food. And we start doing it in small ways. And as we do so, then when the ask get bigger, when God says, now I need you to do this instead, you go, okay. Because you've built this up to the point you've sharpened your affections that you go anything you say. So even for those of us with the dullest affections towards God, a time of fasting shows a preference for God. And so the next time that you're offered a choice to choose God or choose another one of your desires, your affections will be more sharp to choose God. So that's what he means when he says that it puts an edge on our affections. But another purpose for fasting is that it reveals what controls us. It reveals what controls us. The reason our affections need to be so sharp is that we're faced with endless desires that fight for our attention. In fact, some of these greatest competitors for our devotion to God are the gifts that God has given to us himself. See, each gift has an appropriate use, even food. Food is to say, this is to nourish you and to strengthen you and to equip you to do the work that I'm calling to you. But we can easily turn it into overeating or to gluttony or anything else that is beyond what God has called us to do with it. Richard Foster, who wrote a good book on the spiritual disciplines, he shares how our human cravings and our desires are like rivers. But these are rivers that tend to overflow the banks that are intended to contain them. You know, the house I grew up in Kentucky, we had a little creek that would kind of meander right through the middle of it. And it had this little bend right before a big flat spot. And normally, I mean, this creek was just a foot wide, easily jump across it. But on days where we would get, rain for the whole day or, a couple of days, that creek level would slowly rise. And eventually, when it would get to that turn, it would no longer be able to make it and it would just flow over into the flats. And what would happen is this little 1 foot wide creek, in the worst of those storms, would actually grow to be 20 feet wide. It was enormous because it was overflowing its bounds. And so it is, I think, with our desires. We don't intend to let it have greater control. We say, no, we have this under control. We know how much it is. That creek is going to take the bend every time. I know the limits of the banks. But before long, our desires have overrun it. They've come in one after another, just like the rains did. And as that happens, those desires are overflowing the banks that they were designed to be flown to flow within. Fasting, I think I would liken to somewhat of a river dredge. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them or not, but a dredge is designed to go into areas of water and to dig up and to pull up what is on the bottom, to take the loose sediment, the sand, the things that have gathered over time that have built up the bottom of the bank, and instead to make it deeper again, to widen it back out. And by doing so, it's letting it settle. It's allowing the rivers to continue in their paths and to not cause as much flooding as they might normally do. And so that's the role of a river dredge. And so as we think about our desires being rivers that tend to overflow to overflow outside of their banks, then I think fasting is our way of trying to corral those back into the God-ordained methods. So when we fast, we're choosing to say no to a desire. Perhaps even one of God's gifts. We're saying no to this desire and saying, no, I prefer God instead. And so it begins to serve as a tool to test if we have begun to love his gifts more than loving God himself. Let me say that again. When we're fasting, we're using it can be used as a tool to test if we have begun to love God's gifts more than God himself. And this reminds me of a parable that Jesus told in Luke about a man who gives a banquet. This was quite literally a feast time. This is Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 15. When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." But he, speaking of Jesus, said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servants to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I've bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come.'" And then skipping ahead to verse 24, the person throwing the banquet, he says, "For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet." These were being invited to a great feast. The feast that they had all been looking for, the greatest thing that could have possibly been. But instead of embracing it, they chose other things that they desired for their life. For one, it was land. For another, it was the oxen, or perhaps his work. And for the other, it was a new spouse. But by the end, we see that all three had missed their chance at the banquet because of their other desires. Their desires controlled them more than a love for the one who was throwing them this great banquet. Fasting is this longing for the banquet with the King. And as such, it serves to reveal what controls us. Do we want to say yes to this great invitation from the King to enjoy his banquet? Or are our other desires going to take over instead? The fifth purpose I want us to be able to look at is that the fasting can be used for when we need to challenge the status quo. It can be used to challenge the status quo. Now, these are the times when you come to realize that you need more of God's grace. Maybe it's a sin in your life, maybe it's a situation or something that's going on, and you say, "I need God to work more in this situation." Perhaps there are times when you mourn, when you recognize, things are not as they should be. Church, when we look at our streets, when we look at our city, our state, even our nation right now, I flip on the news and I say, things are not the way that they should be. We must challenge the status quo. We see it and we long for our King to return because we know when he does, he's going to make everything instantly right. The absence of our fasting is indicative of our comfort with the way that things are. No one fasts to express how content they are. You don't fast and say, "I kind of like how things are in my life right now." You fast because you realize that something is wrong. You have to challenge the status quo. So as we consider sin in our lives, Christian fasting is a way of expressing that brokenness and to long for more of Jesus in our life. So I want to ask you today, I simply want to ask you, do you hunger for more of God? Do you hunger for the return of our King? Do you hunger for God to be magnified and glorified? And do you hunger to be controlled by nothing but love and devotion to God? Charles Spurgeon, he was a pastor at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in England in the late 1800s. He wrote about his congregation's experience with prayer and fasting. This is what he said. He said, "Our seasons of fasting and prayer at the tabernacle have been high days indeed. Never has heaven's gate stood wider. Never have our hearts been nearer the central glory." There's nothing on this earth that can satisfy our souls besides God. And Christian fasting is simply one means of grace that can bring us nearer the central glory that Spurgeon was just writing about. If you aren't a follower of Jesus, know that he came and that he died for you, that both you and his joy would be made complete, and that your relationship with your Creator would be made whole and would be restored. Fasting is going to be nothing apart from this restored relationship. If he isn't your King, then I beg and I plead with you to ask him to be your king today. But Christian, if you've never fasted like we've talked about today, then I encourage you to do so. And I challenge you to move beyond just let me fast from my social media, or I'm not going to watch this particular show, or things of that nature. Let me push you, if you're able to try fasting without food. Let your whole body express this hunger and desire for God. And if you have questions on what that may look like, our life groups are going to be great places to discuss that and to answer any questions and to find ways that may work well for you. But also this next Saturday, the church is going to be having a congregational fast. Now, Pastor Jonathan has been working on this already. He's been planning it, and so it's going to be tying in perfectly with what we're being able to talk about today. This will be an opportunity where we are able to come and to not come together, but we will all be fasting together for the same purposes. And so some more information is going to be coming out this week, just to help guide you in that time, to let you know what that would look like. And then I know that we'll be trying to come together, at least on Zoom, and breaking that fast together. And I think that's going to be a really sweet time, and I do hope that you will take part with us. But recognize that if anything else, fasting, as simple as it is longing and having a hunger for God and wanting to see him placed above all else in the world. And that's what we desire. And we long for the day when Christ is going to return again. Will you pray with me?